Hey guys, so this is part one of 100 boring facts about World War II, daily life, and common people. No generals moving flags on maps, no dramatic last stands. Just the small, slightly tedious details of how people got up, got dressed, ate something approximate to food, and tried to carry on while the world was on fire. Think of it as walking through the war, not with soldiers in trenches, but with the woman queuing for onions, the kid dodging puddles on the way to a shelter, and the clerk who can't find shoe polish anymore. World War II was massive and chaotic, but it was also a long stretch of surprisingly repetitive, ordinary days. Even when bombs fell or sirens screamed, most of life still revolved around breakfast, laundry, going to work, trying to stay warm, and wondering what would be for dinner when there was almost nothing in the pantry. If you look closely at those boring things, you start to see how people actually lived the war, one dull, improvised habit at a time. In this first part, we'll just hang around in that everyday world. Kitchens with almost no sugar, blackout curtains that never quite fit, half-worn shoes, substitute coffee, pencil-written letters crawling across continents, and dances where half the room was already gone to the front. None of this will win a battle, but all of it is how people survived one. Let's start at the beginning of a day, waking up. One of the least glamorous problems of wartime was simply figuring out what time it was. In several countries, alarm clocks became weirdly precious. In Britain and Germany, for instance, factory production shifted to weapons and vehicles, and the manufacturing of ordinary things like clocks dropped sharply. When clocks broke, there often weren't replacement parts, and new ones were hard to buy. In some industrial towns, so many workers' alarm clocks failed that local authorities and employers worried about people oversleeping and missing shifts in munitions factories. In some places, factories and mines revived a pre-industrial habit, knock-her-up services. Someone would literally go door to door in the early morning, tapping on workers' windows with a stick or a piece of bamboo to wake them up at an agreed hour. In other areas, whistles, sirens, or bell signals from the factory itself would act as a communal alarm clock. The morning routine, instead of a private moment of hitting snooze, became something half the neighborhood shared. If you did manage to wake up on time, the next question was, what do you eat? Rationing is one of the most ordinary-sounding but complex systems that dominated daily life. In Britain, for example, people carried ration books filled with small, dated coupons. To buy basic foods like sugar, butter, meat, and tea, you had to be registered with a specific shop, and the shop could only sell you what your ration allowed. You couldn't just walk around town hunting for extra bacon. If your butcher was out, you waited. Housewives became accidental logisticians, planning meals weeks ahead, counting and tearing out coupons, saving the precious ones for birthdays or holidays. In Germany and Japan, ration cards were also widespread, with different categories for workers, children, and pregnant women, and endless complaints about the quality of what those cards actually got you. In occupied countries, people sometimes carried multiple sets of papers, ration books for the official system, and little discreet notes for black market exchanges. The act of cooking dinner turned into a small administrative project with pages, stamps, and signatures. Clothing, often taken for granted in peacetime, turned into a long experiment in make do and mend. In Britain, this phrase was even an official campaign, Posters and radio programs encouraged people to patch, darn, alter, and repurpose instead of buying new. Men's old suits were unpicked and turned into children's coats. Women's dresses became skirts. Worn-out wool was unraveled and knitted again. In Germany, similar practices were promoted under slogans about frugality and national sacrifice. And in the Soviet Union, people simply had no alternative. New clothes were scarce and often rough. Families might share coats or boots, rotating them for whoever had to go outside that day. In the United States, which was relatively wealthy, fabrics like silk and nylon were diverted to parachutes, leaving women to improvise with rayon or cotton, and stockings became rare enough that women painted seams onto their bare legs with eyebrow pencil or special liquid stocking products. Clothing stopped being fashion in many places and became a slowly deteriorating inventory that everyone worried about, stitch by stitch. Bathing and personal hygiene sound dull until you realize how complicated they became when fuel, water, and soap were limited. In many European cities, coal and gas were rationed, so hot baths were less frequent and shorter. Families would sometimes schedule a bath night when everyone took turns in the same tub, the water growing progressively murkier. Soap itself could be hard to find. In Britain, soap was also rationed, and many people used tiny slivers of bar soap down to almost nothing, collecting the fragments in a jar to melt them into a new, misshapen lump. In Germany and occupied territories, ersatz soaps, made with inferior fats and fillers, left people complaining about their skin. Soviet civilians in besieged cities might go weeks without proper washing, relying on a quick splash from a basin. All the ideals of cleanliness met the reality of limited hot water and a dwindling bar of soap, and the ordinary act of a hot bath became a small luxury, almost a holiday. Nighttime itself was altered by the war, especially in places under threat of bombing. Blackout regulations meant that, after dark, windows had to be covered with heavy curtains or boards so that enemy aircraft couldn't see city lights. Street lamps were dimmed or turned off. Car headlights were fitted with hoods or painted with narrow slits to show just a little light downward. People stumbled through unfamiliar darkness, even in their own neighborhoods, tripping on curbs and bumping into lampposts they knew well by daylight. In Britain, there were countless minor injuries from people falling into ditches or walking into trees under the blackout. In Germany, too, cities vanished into shadow each night. Some people grumbled that they could never find their front gate. Others quietly appreciated seeing the stars more clearly than they ever had before. A simple evening walk became a careful, almost blind shuffle, guided by memory rather than sight. For children in Britain and some other countries, the war could mean waking up not in their own beds, but in strangers' houses far from home. The evacuation of city children to the countryside is often told as a big emotional story, but much of it was simply awkward and everyday. Kids found themselves living with families who ate differently, spoke with unfamiliar accents, and had different rules about mealtimes or chores. Some evacuees discovered bathtubs for the first time. Others had to adapt from indoor plumbing to outdoor toilets. They went to new schools organized on the fly in village halls, church basements, or shared classrooms working in shifts. Parents back in the cities sent letters with cramped handwriting, hoping the post would get through. And children wrote back about feeding chickens or sleeping 3 to a bed in an attic. For the kids, the war was less about frontline maps than about new dinners, strange classmates, and missing their old streets. Food shortages also produced an entire universe of substitute products that were technically edible but rarely enjoyable. In Germany, ersatz coffee made from roasted barley, chicory, or acorns became standard. It was hot, dark, and bitter, but most people agreed it wasn't really coffee. In occupied France, people tried caffeine-free roasted barley drinks as replacements too, joking grimly about their café. In Japan, rice shortages forced people to mix in other grains like barley or millet. And in bad times, even chestnuts or sweet potatoes were used to bulk out meals. Butter was replaced with various spreads made from vegetable oils. Sugar shortages meant saccharin tablets and other artificial sweeteners. In the Soviet Union, citizens ate bread that might be mixed with potato flour or even cellulose. Breakfast across Europe and Asia became an exercise in lowered expectations, with cups of hot brown liquid and slices of bread that didn't quite taste right. Even things as trivial as toothpaste became part of wartime routine. Many toothpaste tubes were made of metal, often tin or lead, and in countries like the U.S. and Britain, you were expected to return your empty tube to the shop to be recycled for the war industry. Some stores would only sell a new one if you handed in an old one. People carefully rolled and squeezed their tubes flat to get the last possible smear, and some switched to tooth powder in cardboard containers. It's the kind of change no one would remember in a big strategy book, but for millions of people, brushing their teeth involved thinking about ammunition factories and scrap drives. Speaking of scrap, one very boring wartime chore was collecting and donating household waste that could be transformed into weapons. In the United States, Britain, and elsewhere, campaigns urged families to save cooking fat from their frying pans because the glycerin extracted from it was used to make explosives. Housewives poured cooled grease into jars and turned them in at butchers' shops or collection centers in exchange for tiny payments or ration bonuses. Children collected old newspapers, scrap metal, and even rubber from worn-out tires and raincoats, dragging bundles to school or local depots. There was nothing glamorous about storing greasy jars in a kitchen corner, but it gave people the sense that their everyday housekeeping, scraping pans, bundling papers, was somehow connected to faraway battlefields. Gardens became miniature battlefields of a different kind. In Britain, the famous Dig for Victory campaign urged citizens to turn lawns, flower beds, and any spare patch of land into vegetable plots. Public parks sprouted rows of cabbages and carrots, and some people even dug up ornamental front gardens to plant potatoes. Allotments, small rented gardening plots, became highly prized. The same sort of movement existed elsewhere. In the U.S., Victory Gardens produced tomatoes, beans, and squash in suburban backyards and on city rooftops. In Germany, small garden colonies outside cities were intensively cultivated. And in the Soviet countryside, individual household plots supplemented collective farms. Gardening, turning soil, weeding rows, watching for frost, became a daily task for millions of people who had never cared much about agriculture before, simply because every extra carrot meant one less item to fight over in the shop queue. Laundry, that eternal chore, didn't stop for war. It just got harder. Soap shortages meant people used less detergent and sometimes washed clothes in cooler water to save fuel. In many households, especially across Europe and Asia, washing was still done by hand, with large tubs, scrub boards, and hours of labor. White fabrics gradually turned gray, And garments wore out faster because they were being used more heavily, but washed less effectively. In big cities, air raids threatened laundry day. Clothes hung on outdoor lines might be soaked in soot from fires, or washing basins tipped over in a rush for the shelter. In cold climates, shirts might be dried indoors near the stove, making cramped rooms smell of damp cloth and soap. Army uniforms, working overalls, school blouses, every piece of fabric was part of a continuous cycle of washing, drying, mending, and re-wearing that ate up large chunks of people's time, war or no war. Communication with family and friends far away turned into a mix of patience and censorship. Letters crawled across continents by ship, train, and sometimes by microfilm. The U.S. and Britain used V-mail or airgraph systems, where letters were photographed onto tiny film, transported, and then printed out again at the destination to save space and weight. The result was little reduced-size sheets with faint typewritten or handwritten lines. In many countries, mail was subject to censorship. Envelopes were opened, passages were blacked out, or entire letters vanished if they mentioned sensitive topics. People learned to write in vague, careful language, hinting at hardships but not stating them clearly. Civilians waited weeks or months for a short note that said, "I am well," and not much else. The everyday ritual of walking to the post box or stopping by the post office window became a barometer of hope or disappointment. Despite shortages, people still tried to have social lives. Dances, church socials, and small gatherings were ways to forget the war for an evening. But even these were shaped by mundane wartime details. Curfews, lack of fuel for travel, blackout rules limiting lighting, and the absence of many young men. In Britain and the U.S., dances were often packed with women and a handful of men in uniform on leave, leading to crowded floors and complicated social expectations. In Germany, too, there were concerts and evenings at beer halls, though many people had to make do with weaker beer and fewer snacks. Soft drinks, snacks, and sweets were expensive or limited, so a simple slice of cake at a cafe might be a rare treat. Couples met, flirted, and sometimes got engaged under those constraints, building relationships on hurried visits and stacks of letters, rather than long, relaxed courtships. Radios became the background soundtrack of the war for those who had access to them. Families gathered around sets to hear news bulletins, propaganda, music, and drama programs. In some countries, like Germany, owning a radio had been encouraged before the war, and cheap people's receivers were common, but they were officially tuned to approved stations only. Tuning into foreign broadcasts like the BBC was forbidden and could be dangerous. People did it anyway, quietly, with the volume low. In occupied Europe, secret listening to Allied radio became a quiet household ritual in some homes, often followed by whispered discussions over the kitchen table. In the U.S. and Britain, radio comedians and variety shows became small islands of normality, cracking jokes about rationing and bureaucracy. While battles raged, millions of people stirred soup, darned socks, or ironed shirts with a radio voice constantly in the background, blending world events with domestic tasks. Transport had its own set of boring complications. Fuel rationing and vehicle requisition meant fewer private cars on the roads in many countries. In Britain and much of Europe, civilians heavily relied on bicycles, but bike tires and inner tubes were made from rubber, which was scarce, so tires were patched endlessly and often ridden half flat, In Japan, too, bicycles became vital in cities as gasoline supplies dwindled. Horse-drawn carts reappeared in some places where trucks were scarce or broken. People walked more, to work, to shops, to see relatives, carrying bundles because delivery services were limited. Long queues formed not only at shops, but at tram stops and bus stops where vehicles were overcrowded and infrequent. Getting from one side of a city to the other wasn't a dramatic adventure. It was a slow, often uncomfortable trudge or ride, made worse by blackout, bomb damage, and unreliable schedules. Even pets were affected by the war in quiet, sad ways. In Britain, at the very beginning of the conflict, there was a wave of pet euthanasia. Owners, frightened by the prospect of bombings and food shortages, brought their dogs and cats to veterinarians to be put down. Many later regretted this impulsive decision, but it was done in a mood of panic. During the war, people who kept pets had to share scarce food with them or find creative substitutes. Children had to let go of beloved animals when families evacuated or moved. In other countries, dogs served as messengers, guards, or even as anti-tank animals in grim Soviet experiments, while ordinary households struggled to keep any animals at all. Feeding a cat or walking a dog through deserted, dim streets became another layer of compromise between affection and necessity. Shelters, too, became some of the most familiar and unglamorous spaces of wartime cities. In Britain, the government issued metal Anderson shelters for gardens, corrugated iron half buried in the ground, and later introduced Morrison shelters, heavy steel tables under which a family could sleep inside the house. People spread old blankets and mattresses inside, hung up bits of fabric to make them feel homier, and kept basic supplies like candles, biscuits, and a thermos of tea. In Germany, air raid cellars, subway tunnels, and purpose-built shelters served similar roles. The experience of sitting shoulder to shoulder with neighbors, listening for distant explosions, and trying to keep children calm, repeated night after night. People played cards, knitted, tried to sleep, or just sat in silence. It was monotonous terror, if there is such a thing. Nothing to do but wait and try to ignore the dust falling from the ceiling. School life adapted quietly to all these changes. Children in many countries had air raid drills, where they practiced putting on gas masks or filing into shelters. In some British schools, kids carried their gas masks in small cardboard boxes slung over their shoulders at all times. They became just another annoying piece of daily gear, like a backpack today. Classrooms sometimes shared space with evacuee children, doubling class sizes or splitting the day into shifts. Lessons were interrupted by sirens, and teachers continued reading or writing on the board in crowded shelters. In the Soviet Union, some schools operated in bombed-out buildings or improvised locations, while older children were pulled out of class entirely to help with farm work or factory tasks. Homework, exams, and arithmetic problems existed alongside ration queues, blackout drills, and letters from the front pinned to the family's wall. Queuing itself was an entire way of life. In many places, particularly in Europe and the Soviet Union, standing in line was how you got almost anything: bread, meat, fuel, shoes, fabric, even soap. People became experts at reading the length and mood of a queue to guess what was available at the front. They brought stools or crates to sit on, knitting to pass the time, and gossip to trade. Rumors about new deliveries or changes in ration rules passed down lines quickly. Some governments tried to regulate or stagger queues, but there was no way around the basic truth: everything took longer. An ordinary day for a housewife or older child might involve several hours just waiting in front of different shops, watching the queue shrink painfully slowly, only to reach the counter and hear, "Nothing left." Despite all this, people still cared about their appearance, which led to some quietly inventive beauty habits. With stockings in short supply, many women in Britain and elsewhere painted their legs with tinted creams or even brewed tea, then drew a line down the back of each leg with an eyebrow pencil to mimic the seam of a stocking. Hair care was affected by the scarcity of shampoo and hairpins. Women working in factories had to tie their hair up with scarves to avoid accidents, which became a common look. In Germany and Japan, official propaganda sometimes encouraged plainer styles as more suitable for wartime, but people still saved lipstick or face powder for special occasions. Visiting a hairdresser, if you could afford it, was not just vanity, but a small claim to normality. Even soldiers' loved ones wrote in letters about haircuts and dresses, as if to insist that life contained more than uniforms and ration cards. All of these everyday details, alarm clocks that didn't work, blackout curtains pinned with whatever you had, ersatz coffee, the slow grind of queues, jars of cooking fat waiting to be collected, are the quiet backbone of World War II. They aren't heroic, and they aren't cinematic. They are, in many ways, boring. But for most people, that is what the war actually was. Not one long battle scene, but a string of slightly uncomfortable, slightly anxious, strangely ordinary days. In the next parts, we'll keep digging into those small realities from other angles: workplaces, housing, childhood, small acts of resistance, and the ways people tried to have fun when there was almost nothing to spare. For now, just imagine a world where the most exciting thing that happens in a week might be finding a little extra sugar, or hearing a rumor that the shop on the corner has oranges in stock for the first time in months. That was World War II, too. 21st. For millions of people, war work mostly meant doing the same repetitive motions thousands of times a day in a place that smelled of oil, sweat, and disinfectant. A woman in a British aircraft factory might spend 10 hours drilling the same 3 holes into sheets of aluminum. A teenager in a Soviet munitions plant could stand at a press, stamping out shell casings until their hands shook. Nothing about it felt like a stirring victory montage. It felt like standing, waiting for the lunch whistle, counting how many pieces you had left in your quota, and wondering if your feet would ever stop hurting. The posters on the wall shouted about glory and sacrifice. The people beneath them mostly thought about aching backs and whether the canteen would still have tea by the time they got there. 22nd. Office workers also had a war, and it was not very cinematic. Someone had to file ration records, type casualty lists, process evacuation forms, catalog bomb damage, and update payrolls for constantly shifting staff. In London, Berlin, Washington, and Tokyo, clerks stayed late under flickering lamps, writing out forms in neat handwriting or pecking at typewriters that jammed constantly. They read the same names over and over, checked the same figures, stamped the same documents until the ink pads dried out. Sometimes the numbers represented something awful: missing persons, lost homes. But the daily experience was still mostly numbers, staples, and piles of paper that never seemed to get smaller. The bureaucracy of total war ran on in-trays and out-trays. 23rd. Shift work rearranged people's lives in a way that felt less like adventure
and more like permanent jet lag. With factories running around the clock, day and night lost their old meanings. You could have breakfast at 5 p.m.
before heading to a 12-hour night shift, or stumble out of a plant at dawn when everyone else was just waking up. Neighbors passed each other like ghosts, one coming home as the other went out. Curtains stayed drawn at odd hours, not for secrecy, but because someone was trying to sleep. In industrial cities from Detroit to Essen to Osaka, entire streets were out of sync with themselves, with one part of the population always tired, and the other always getting ready to be tired soon. 24th. In many places, the war meant that women suddenly did jobs they had previously only walked past. They became welders, tram conductors, bus drivers, crane operators, truck mechanics, and farm managers. Not always because society had become enlightened, but because there was simply no one else. Yet the work itself was often dull and monotonous, just as it had been for men. Women in overalls stood beside conveyor belts or at lathes, measuring and cutting to the same specification 1,000 times a day. The novelty of the role wore off quickly. The boredom, the grime, and the unequal pay did not. And when their shifts ended, many went home not to rest, but to cook, queue, mend, and manage households that still somehow expected the laundry to be done. 25th. Children and teenagers were pulled into the work world in ways that felt very grown up and very tedious at the same time. In Germany, boys in the Hitler Youth and girls in the League of German Girls spent long days helping with harvests or collecting scrap instead of going to school. In Britain, school kids were sent to pick potatoes or help with dig for victory gardens, pulling weeds until their backs hurt. Soviet teenagers worked in factories or on kolkhozes, sometimes doing the same repetitive tasks as adults, but for less food. They were told they were part of something heroic, but the reality was blistered hands, muddy boots, and the slow realization that schoolwork had been replaced by tasks that never ended and rarely received any thanks. 26th. Commutes became their own small battle, and rarely an exciting one. Buses and trams were overcrowded, gasoline was rationed, and blackout regulations made traveling at night feel like moving through velvet darkness. In cities from London to Tokyo, people clung to the sides of trams, stood on bus steps, and learned every shortcut by foot. Trains were packed with workers, soldiers, evacuees, and luggage. You might stand for hours with someone's suitcase pressed into your knees. In winter, unheated carriages turned breath to fog on the windows. People read ration books, crumpled newspapers, or nothing at all, dozing standing up. Every day the same stations, the same delays, the same slow, jostling tide of bodies moving to and from work. 27th. Housing, too, shifted from home to where we are for now. In bombed cities, families slept in rooms without glass where cardboard covered shattered windows and blankets tried to keep drafts at bay. Plaster dust got into everything. Furniture was pushed away from walls that might collapse. In less damaged places, housing shortages meant taking in lodgers, sometimes polite, sometimes not, into already cramped homes. Strangers slept in spare rooms, on sofas, even on kitchen floors. A hallway might become a bedroom. A dining room might vanish behind a curtain and a camp bed. The line between private and public blurred slowly, not with drama, but with one more suitcase and one more person promising they would only be there for a little while. 28th. Evacuation reshaped who lived where, often in ways that felt awkward more than anything else. City children from London or Berlin or Osaka found themselves in rural villages where people spoke with strange accents, ate unfamiliar food, and expected different manners. They brought their own boredom with them, the longing for old friends, familiar streets, favorite corners of home now out of reach. Rural families suddenly had extra mouths to feed, extra beds to arrange, and new routines to negotiate. Evacuees learned which drawers they were allowed to open, which chairs they could sit in, which chores they were expected to do. The war, for them, often meant learning to tread carefully in someone else's house for months or years. 29th. Blackouts turned homes into small islands of dim light and improvised inconvenience. Curtains had to be thick and carefully drawn. Crack a window the wrong way, and an air raid warden might knock angrily on your door. Streetlights vanished. People stubbed their toes on furniture they knew perfectly well in daylight. Families experimented with candle placement, bits of cardboard, and black paint on windows. At night, going to the toilet could require a flashlight, a candle, or just cautious hands along the wall. People developed a mental map of where the creaky floorboards were and how many steps led from bedroom to kitchen without seeing them. It wasn't dramatic courage. It was learning how not to fall down your own stairs in the dark. 30th. Heating and fuel shortages slowly changed the way people used their homes. Rooms that had once been separate, a formal dining room, a sitting room, a bedroom, collapsed into a single space where the one working stove or fireplace lived. Families ate, read, sewed, and sometimes all slept in the same room because it was the only one even slightly warm. Doors stayed shut to keep out drafts. Unused rooms gathered dust and cold. Furniture was rearranged around fuel, not comfort. In some places, even furniture itself became fuel. People quietly broke up old chairs or banisters to burn in stoves, telling themselves they had never much liked them anyway, while wondering what they would sit on when the war was over. 31st. Everyday noise changed. The background soundtrack of life in industrial areas became the steady, mechanical roar of war production. The thump of presses, the whine of machinery, the clatter of lorries on bad roads seeped into houses at all hours. In some cities, the silence when power failed or a factory shut briefly for repair felt startling. People got used to shouting over noise without noticing it. Children learned to fall asleep to the distant rumble of plants and trains. For others, especially in rural areas, the new sounds were planes overhead, convoys on nearby roads, or loudspeakers blaring announcements. The war didn't sound like constant explosions. It sounded like engines that never quite stopped, and sirens that occasionally did. 32nd. Privacy became a rare luxury. In crowded apartments, shared houses, barracks, and dormitories, you could hear your neighbors arguing, your co-workers snoring, your siblings tossing restlessly in narrow beds. Letters from loved ones were sometimes read aloud because there wasn't really a space to read them quietly. Thin walls and cramped rooms meant everyone knew when someone had a cold, a crying baby, or a secret phone call. In some places, official surveillance compounded the feeling. Informers, censored mail, suspicious questions. But most of the time, privacy was undermined not by the secret police, but by too many people and not enough space. Time alone meant a few minutes fetching water, standing in a stairwell, or taking an unnecessarily slow walk back from the shops. 33rd. Doing chores could feel like combat logistics on a miniature scale. Laundry, without modern detergents or reliable hot water, became a half-day operation, hauling water, heating it carefully, scrubbing clothes by hand, rinsing, wringing them out with aching arms, then hunting for somewhere to hang them that wasn't already occupied. Soap itself was often poor quality or diluted. Fabrics wore out faster but were harder to replace because textiles were rationed or unavailable. People darned socks until they were more darning than original wool. Washing floors, cleaning soot from blackout stoves, or dealing with coal dust became endless, repetitive tasks, unnoticed in war movies but unavoidable in real kitchens, where every new layer of grime felt slightly more permanent than the last. 34th. Paperwork invaded life in a slow, persistent way. Identity cards, ration books, travel permits, work assignments, change of address forms, evacuation documents, letters from authorities, all of these had to be filled, stamped, carried, and produced on demand. A night out might require checking that your ID was in one pocket, your ration coupons in another, and your work pass in a third. Lose the wrong piece of paper, and you could lose access to food, fuel, or wages until it was replaced. People developed small rituals for keeping documents safe. Envelopes tucked behind religious icons, strings pinned inside coats, boxes kept under beds. The war turned everyone into minor document archivists, managing small collections of fragile, crucial rectangles of paper. 35th. The mail became both a lifeline and a source of constant, petty irritation. Letters were delayed, censored, lost, or delivered out of order. People waited weeks for news, then received 3 letters at once, all answering questions they had already forgotten asking. Packages of food or small gifts went missing or arrived spoiled. Telegrams, which often brought bad news, were dreaded. The sight of a telegraph boy on a bicycle could make a whole street hold its breath. At the same time, many letters contained the most mundane details: what someone had for dinner, how work was going, a new neighbor's habits. Keeping up a flow of ordinary chatter across the distance was its own quiet labor. 36th. For many people under occupation, work meant navigating a gray area between survival and collaboration. That felt less like a dramatic moral test and more like a daily grind of uncomfortable compromises. A French railway worker still had to show up, repair tracks, and move trains, some of which carried German supplies, because that was his job and his wage. A Dutch office clerk might process forms she disliked under rules she distrusted. A Polish farmer might be required to deliver a quota of grain to occupiers who paid poorly or not at all. The conversations around kitchen tables were less about ideology, more about questions like, do we keep this job, which feeds us but serves them, or risk starvation and punishment by quitting? 37th. In the Soviet Union and other heavily mobilized states, workers were often tied to their factories or collective farms in ways that blurred the boundary between work and home almost completely. People slept in barracks near factories, ate in canteens at long tables, and shared overcrowded dormitory rooms. Personal time shrank to an hour here and there between shifts. Factory walls became ersatz community centers, with notice boards listing production targets, political slogans, lists of heroes of labor, and sometimes public shaming of those who underperformed. Leisure activities, when organized, often happened in the same places: lectures in the shop floor, concerts in the yard, movies projected against factory walls. The everyday reality was a sort of industrial village life, intense and repetitive. 38th. Transport breakdowns and shortages shaped work schedules in small but stubborn ways. A bus that stopped running meant a 2-hour walk each way. A train line closed for military use added hours of detours. People left home in the dark to ensure they arrived on time, then sat on cold benches outside locked factory gates because they had arrived too early. Bicycles, where available, became precious, patched and repatched, with tires stuffed with rags when rubber ran out. In some occupied regions, requisitioning meant that villagers watched their carts, horses, or trucks taken away and then walked everywhere. There was little drama in this, just longer journeys, sorer feet, and a slow acceptance that nothing would be easy to reach for a while. 39th. Even in war, many people's working day still ended with a familiar, almost stubbornly normal routine. In a small town far from the front, a shopkeeper still counted the day's receipts, put away goods, swept the floor, and locked up, just as they had before. The shop sold different things: coarser bread, ersatz coffee, strange canned meat. But the rhythm was the same: open, serve, tidy, close. Teachers in relatively untouched areas still marked homework by dim light, wrote lesson plans, and worried about unruly pupils. Farmers still watched the weather anxiously, checking the sky for signs of rain or frost, and for planes as well. The war altered everything and yet left the basic structure of a working day intact in countless places. 40th. Perhaps the most boring fact about work and housing during the Second World War is that people adapted to conditions they would once have found unthinkable, and then treated them as normal. A cot squeezed into a hallway became my room. A 12-hour shift with a long walk at each end became my job. Ration cards, blacked-out windows, shared wash basins, and missing doors turned into the backdrop against which other dramas, love affairs, petty arguments, inside jokes, played out. The war did not feel like a single, coherent event from the point of view of these factory floors and crowded kitchens. It felt like a long series of days in which you got up, went to work, stood in line, shared your space, and tried in dozens of small ways to make that cramped, tired life feel a bit more like living and a bit less like just getting through. In the next part, we will step into childhood more fully, schools that moved, games that had to be played quietly, and the particular mixture of fear and boredom that shaped the war years for those who were young enough to be shielded from some truths, but not from the blackout. For children, the war often arrived first as an interruption. Something stopped or moved or suddenly became forbidden. The school down the road closed after a bomb blew out its windows, or it turned into a first aid post or a billeting center. A child might wake up one morning to find that instead of going to class with their usual teacher, they were being put on a train with a number tag pinned to their coat, told to hold on to their little brother's hand and not let go. Adults spoke over their heads and called this evacuation, relocation, something sensible like that. What it felt like to the small people in the middle of it was more basic. A long ride to somewhere they'd never seen, to sleep in a bed that smelled of other people's soap. In Britain, in Germany, in Japan, in parts of the Soviet Union, schools kept disappearing and reappearing. A building that had always been a school became a hospital. A hospital hit by bombs became a pile of shattered tiles. A church hall became a classroom with chalk marks still on the wooden panels from last Sunday's hymn numbers. Children got used to learning in spaces that didn't quite fit the job. In barns that smelled of hay and manure, in basements that hummed with the sound of pipes and distant explosions, in half-finished factory canteens
where the lessons had to pause whenever a shift ended and workers flooded through.
The timetable was as shaky as the walls. Some schools went to double or even triple shifts. Younger pupils might come at dawn and be sent home by mid-morning so that older ones could use the same rooms in the afternoon. Night school classes for adults would take over after darkness fell. The school day shrank but became more intense. Less play, fewer songs, more hurry. Teachers, like everyone else, were being called up, moved around, killed. The shortage meant that a class might go from a strict, trained teacher one month to a tired, half-deaf veteran the next, then to a teenage girl who had finished her own schooling only a year earlier and now stood at the front, clutching a pile of rationed exercise books and wondering how to control 40 restless children. Textbooks migrated as well. Those that came with the government's stamp were often full of diagrams of tanks and planes, portraits of leaders, maps shaded in to show territories gained or lost. But there were never enough copies to go around, so pages were shared, turned with care, copied hastily onto scraps of paper. In some places, children learned to hold a book sideways or upside down, so that 2 or 3 could read it at once. When the siren sounded, whatever they had been reading was left open on desks or folded under arms as everyone trooped down to the shelter, hoping to pick up the line later as if nothing had happened. In occupied countries, school itself became a political question. In Poland, in parts of the Soviet Union, in Korea under Japanese rule, official schools tried to replace one language with another. Lessons that had once been in Polish or Korean became German or Japanese or Russian. Stories of local heroes disappeared from the syllabus. Some children dutifully copied strange alphabets and recited foreign slogans without much understanding, thinking of them as just more schoolwork. Others attended secret classes after hours, lessons in someone's kitchen, behind a closed workshop door, in a back room of a church, where they practiced the forbidden language in whispers and read smudged copies of banned poems. For these children, homework might include not only arithmetic, but also remembering that none of this must be mentioned to the neighbor whose husband had joined the new police. Even where schools stayed open and in the same place, their contents thinned out. The war ate up paper and pencils, chalk and ink. Blackboard chalk became a precious commodity. Teachers used the tiniest nubs until their fingertips turned white, then switched to leftover construction chalk that scratched and squealed. Exercise books were rationed. Children learned to write small, to fill every margin, to rub out old arithmetic problems so the same page could be used again. It was not uncommon to find layers of years in a single notebook. Beneath the neat handwriting of 1941, older sums and spelling lists faintly visible from 1939, like the outline of ghosts. The games adapted themselves to these new conditions, almost without anyone deciding they should. Children have always played war, but in wartime this was oddly both easier and more complicated. Real tanks could be seen rumbling down the street, and real planes droned overhead. In some places, boys, and sometimes girls, collected shell fragments from the ground after raids and traded them the way they might once have swapped marbles or pretty stones. They learned, very quickly, which were hot and dangerous to touch and which were safe. Small boys in bombed cities became unofficial experts in identifying planes by their silhouettes and the pitch of their engines. They turned this knowledge into a game. Who could name the type first? Who could tell whether it was ours or theirs? Even when the adults around them flinched at the sound and looked for the nearest doorway. Other games had to get quieter. In cities under blackout orders, children were told to keep curtains tightly drawn at night, so no stray chink of light would guide the bombers.
That meant no playing by the window after dark.
No shouting in a courtyard where sound carried too well. No stepping outside with a candle. Hide and seek changed when the inside of a house became almost completely dark. Children learned the feel of banisters, the texture of each door, the creak of certain floorboards. They played touch and whisper games in cellars crowded with neighbors during raids, turning fear into something with rules and winners. Resourcefulness became part of childhood almost as soon as walking did. Toys that in peacetime would have been bought ready-made often had to be improvised. A doll could be fashioned from an old stocking stuffed with rags, a face drawn on with the ink that had to last until term's end. Wooden offcuts from a factory became building blocks. Discarded buttons became coins in homemade board games. Children in rural areas turned to nature. A horse chestnut could be the head of a soldier, a stick the rifle, a patch of mud an entire battlefield. In cities, bombed-out buildings offered a different kind of raw material. Bricks for forts, twisted metal for pretend weapons, broken glass for jewels that adults told them not to touch. Some of these makeshift toys were explicitly shaped by the war. In Germany, Britain, the Soviet Union, Japan, toy shops that remained open sold miniature tanks and planes. Cardboard model kits let children build battleships at the kitchen table. Patriotic board games had players risk U-boat attacks or air raids on paper maps. Adults who worried about children being frightened by the war nevertheless bought them these games, seeing them as educational, a way to make sense of things. Children mostly treated them as they had always treated games, a way to pass time, to argue about rules, to cheat, to win, to sulk when they lost. In many households, children's play bled into small acts of war work. In Britain, school children were sent out to collect scrap metal, rubber, old newspapers, and bones for recycling. Hunting for useful rubbish became an organized competition. Schools that brought in the most were praised in local papers. What the children mostly experienced was the thrill of being allowed to roam a bit farther than usual, poke around in alleys and sheds, and return triumphantly with some strange object that an adult might take seriously enough to write down its weight. In the Soviet Union, even younger children took part in subotniks, voluntary Saturday work, picking potatoes, gathering firewood, sweeping streets. They were told this was helping to defeat the enemy. A 6-year-old might not grasp the full meaning of that, but they understood being thanked solemnly by an important-looking person and clapped by their classmates. Food shaped childhood memories of the war as much as noise and fear did. In countries under strict rationing, the taste of sweetness, or its absence, became a central fact of everyday life. A single orange at Christmas, a small square of chocolate on a birthday, a spoonful of jam eaten straight from the jar when adults were not looking. These small luxuries, rare and carefully hoarded, lodged themselves deep in memory. Children in Britain remembered the chalky, oddly flavored national milk tablets given out as supplements, or the strange texture of Woolton pie, a vegetable pie named after the minister in charge of food. German children remembered ersatz coffee made from roasted barley, and bread stretched with other grains. Japanese children in cities, especially toward the end of the war, learned to live with constant hunger. Their games sometimes revolved around imaginary feasts described in mouth-watering detail. School meals, where they existed, were at once a relief and a disappointment. A bowl of thin soup and a piece of bread might be the only hot food some children got that day. They accepted it as normal that a lunchtime queue could be as long as the one outside the butcher's, that sometimes the bread ran out, or the soup was too watery to fill the stomach. Teachers tried to keep spirits up with talk about vitamins and good health. Children listened politely and then devised schemes to trade the foods they disliked, the boiled beets, the watery cabbage, for something better. In some countries, like the United States and Australia, where food shortages were less severe, children raised victory gardens in schoolyards, planting cabbages and carrots and learning to feel a small ownership over whatever grew. The emotional weather of childhood during the war could shift quickly and often without explanation. Adults rarely sat down and explained the whole situation. They parceled out information in bits, protecting children where they could and misjudging where they couldn't. A child might sense tension rising at home without knowing why. A father called up, a letter from the front, a rumor about neighbors being arrested. A worrying conversation halted when small footsteps were heard in the hallway. Silence, more than speeches, taught children that some questions should not be asked. In many families, especially in Europe and Asia, at least one parent was absent, at the front, in a labor camp, on a distant base. Children became used to this absence and to the things that filled it. A photograph on a shelf with a little ribbon pinned to the frame. A bundle of letters tied with string, read over and over again by a mother whose eyes sometimes filled with tears without any obvious cause. For some children, the absent parent became an almost imaginary figure, half hero, half stranger, whose return was longed for and feared in equal measure. They pictured them in uniforms, doing important, brave things. Reality, when it arrived, might be a quiet, tired stranger at the kitchen table who didn't want to play, or a father who never returned at all. The war also redefined what counted as bravery in a child. Adults praised being good in the shelter, not crying during a raid, not wetting the bed when bombs fell. Small acts of self-control became medals of an informal kind. Children quickly learned this and sometimes tried to perform courage, standing very straight, cracking jokes in the cellar, talking loudly about how they were not afraid at all, as much for their own benefit as for anyone else's. Others reacted in the opposite way, becoming clingy, waking, screaming from dreams they couldn't describe. In overcrowded homes and shelters, there was rarely space to fall apart. Some did it anyway. Propaganda targeted young people as deliberately as it did adults. In classrooms, at scout or youth meetings, in cinemas before the main film, children were shown cartoons and newsreels that simplified the war into clear stories of good and bad. In Germany and Italy, and later in occupied countries, party youth organizations organized hikes, games, and songs that mixed fun with ideology. In Japan, school children bowed daily toward the emperor's palace and practiced military drills in the playground. In the Soviet Union, young pioneer meetings combined summer camp atmosphere with lectures on vigilance and sacrifice. Many children enjoyed the uniforms, the sense of belonging, the camping trips. The political content slid in alongside the pleasures of singing together and roasting potatoes over a fire. Even where political indoctrination was less intense, the war entered children's imaginations through stories. Fairy tales were subtly updated. Wolves became spies. Dragons resembled enemy nations. Brave princes wore uniforms. Comic books and boys' adventure novels filled themselves with dashing pilots and cunning saboteurs. Many a 10-year-old boy lay in bed fantasizing not about magic swords, but about shooting down enemy planes or blowing up a bridge. Some then stepped out the next day into rubble-strewn streets where very similar things were happening for real, just not with the clear heroics and happy endings they had imagined.
The border between play war and real war could become disturbingly thin, especially in places where fighting came close. In the Balkans and parts of the Soviet countryside, in occupied China, children saw armed partisans move through forests, heard real gunfire,
Watched real soldiers, on one side or the other, march into their village. They played at being partisans with wooden rifles and cardboard armbands, copying what they had seen. A few older teenagers stepped over from imitation to reality, acting as couriers or lookouts. Parents tried to keep younger ones away from anything truly dangerous, but in some territories under long occupation, the presence of guns and uniforms became almost ordinary background. For other children, especially evacuees sent from cities to rural areas, the war meant a double dislocation, away from one home that had grown familiar into another that was strange in a quieter way. City children arrived in small villages with different accents, different manners, sometimes different religions. They might have to learn how to use an outdoor toilet, How to deal with chickens and cows. How to walk miles to school along muddy roads. Some were taken in by kind families who treated them as one of their own, fed them better than they had ever been fed before, and insisted on warm clothes and regular bedtimes. Others ended up as half-servants, expected to work long hours in fields or households in exchange for their keep, away from siblings, spoken to in a dialect they barely understood. For them, the war years were defined less by bombs than by milking, weeding, cleaning, and a steady ache of homesickness. A different, more secret kind of dislocation shaped the lives of children in hiding. Jewish children in occupied Europe, children of resistance members, political dissidents, and others at risk were sometimes sent to live under assumed identities. They were drilled in new names, new birthdays, new facts about their parents. A little girl who had spoken Yiddish at home might have to remember never to let a word of it slip in her new Catholic boarding school. A boy who had been told always to be honest now learned that lying convincingly and all the time was the only way to stay alive. Their days could be boring in the extreme, staying indoors, keeping quiet, listening to grown-ups whispering, and at the same time charged with a tension far beyond their years. For children in the United States, Canada, Australia, and some parts of Latin America, the war was often something glimpsed on posters, in movie newsreels, or in the faces of returning soldiers rather than in the landscape itself. Their schools ran scrap drives and war bond campaigns. They memorized songs about doing your bit. They practiced air raid drills, crawling under desks or filing into hallways, even in towns that would never be bombed. The war broke into their lives through absence, a brother gone overseas, a cousin's letter from somewhere in the Pacific, more than through direct danger. They grew up, in many cases, with a strange mixture of safety and vicarious anxiety, watching their parents study casualty lists in the paper over breakfast. Daily routines, more than dramatic moments, formed the backbone of war childhoods. A morning might start with checking the windows for broken glass, sweeping up if last night's raid had rattled something loose. Then there would be the small battles over getting washed when the water was cold and the soap poor, over who got to wear which mended socks that day. The walk to school might pass fresh bomb damage, or new troop convoys, or simply the same queues at the same shops as the day before. Once in class, children recited times tables, as they always had, stumbled through foreign vocabulary, copied diagrams, whispered, passed notes. The teacher's anger at inattention, the boredom of long explanations, the relief when the bell finally rang, none of this changed much in wartime. Homework competed with other tasks. In cities, older children might be expected to help patch windows with tape,
carry buckets of sand up to the attic, or take a turn on fire-watching duty on flat rooftops. They were taught how to spot incendiary bombs, how to smother them with sand, how not to use water on certain types.
The instructions turned into a kind of grim game, identifying different shapes and colors of ordnance from training leaflets and posters. In rural areas, school lessons often had to be done after long hours in fields or barns, especially during harvest. Teachers knew this and sometimes turned a blind eye to half-finished work or turned agricultural labor itself into a subject, writing compositions about harvests, doing sums based on yields. Even leisure time, what little there was of it, bore the marks of war. Going to the cinema where possible offered not just entertainment, but also a warm, dark place to nap, to sneak a hand into someone's borrowed bag of sweets, to sit in a seat that was not your own home's hard chair. Newsreels played before the main feature showed frontline footage, leaders speechifying, flags waving. Children saw more images of distant battlefields this way than they ever would have otherwise. They half-watched, half-fidgeted, more interested in the cartoons or the cowboy film that followed. Yet the images seeped in, columns of prisoners, bombed-out landscapes from other countries that looked disconcertingly like their own neighborhood. Bedtime routines were often the last refuge of normality. Parents tried to maintain them even when everything else had changed. Stories were told, sometimes carefully chosen to be cheerful, sometimes out of sheer tiredness the same ones as before the war. Children lay in bed and listened, not only to the familiar cadences of fairy tales, but also to more distant sounds, sirens, the thump of guns, the rumble of trains carrying unknown things in the night. In cold houses, siblings shared beds for warmth, whispers carried back and forth under blankets, speculating about what would happen tomorrow, or whether the war would be over soon, or what over might even mean. Time itself felt strange to these children. In some places it seemed compressed, weeks punctuated by raids, marches, sudden moves. In others, especially in later years of occupation or blockade, it stretched into a long sameness of shortages, curfews, and waiting, for letters, for the knock on the door, for the end. Adults measured time by campaigns, by offensives, by political announcements. Children measured it by school terms, by birthdays when they hoped for something special and rarely got it, by rumors that it will surely be over by Christmas, which rolled on from one year to the next like a promise that kept dissolving. Looking back later, many of them described their wartime childhoods as somehow both quiet and intense. There were long stretches of boredom, the same chores, the same cues, the same drills, broken by moments when they suddenly understood that something very big and very dangerous was happening just beyond the walls of their ordinary days. They carried on arguing with siblings, cheating at games, skipping tasks, complaining about homework, falling in and out of friendships, all under a sky that occasionally flashed with searchlights or glowed red on the horizon. To the adults running the war, these children were background, future soldiers, future workers, future mothers, a problem of logistics and nutrition. To themselves, they were just trying to grow up under oddly specific rules. Don't show light at night. Don't pick up shiny metal things. Don't mention what you heard Uncle say about the government. Their world was smaller than the maps in the newspapers, but richer in detail. The exact smell of a damp shelter, the weight of a gas mask on the chest, the beloved chipped mug rationed with just enough cocoa powder to make warm water taste like something else. In the next part, we will leave the schoolyards and shelters to follow some of those older brothers, uncles, and neighbors as they stepped into uniforms. Away from the sweeping arrows and battle names on history book maps, we will listen instead to the slow, repetitive, often uncomfortable routines that made up the vast majority of a soldier's war. Drills, marches, cleaning, waiting, and the small, stubborn efforts to remain a person inside a very large machine.
When they finally stepped into uniform, the first thing most of them discovered was not heroism or destiny, but that their feet hurt. Boots were a recurring theme of the war. Millions of pairs, ordered by number, stacked in depots, handed out by bored corporals. No matter the country, the boots were almost always wrong. Too big, because the quartermaster was out of your size and, "You'll grow into them, lad." Too small, because you were late to supply issue. Too stiff, too worn. The first marches of the war were filled less with stirring songs than with quiet swearing and the slap of new leather against raw skin. The journey into soldierhood often began in a queue. A line outside a draft board office, a police station, a village hall, a party building. Men stood with papers in their hands, call-up notices, summonses, permission slips, shuffling forward as a clerk somewhere inside copied their names into the war's enormous filing cabinet. Inside, things got oddly intimate very quickly. In the induction halls of Liverpool, Hamburg, Boston, Osaka, Kharkiv, they were reduced to bodies and numbers. Clothes off, arms up, open your mouth, bend over, breathe in, don't cough on the doctor. Stethoscopes tapped ribs, fingers pressed bellies, eyes peered into mouths. Some saw electricity for the first time in the form of a bare bulb swinging overhead in a crowded examination room. Most remember the needles. A row of men, bare-armed, rolling their sleeves higher, watching the first in line wince at the jab of vaccination. Some fainted. It was universally funny, as long as you weren't the one on the floor. The prick of the needle was supposed to defend against typhoid, cholera, smallpox. No injection existed against fear, boredom, homesickness, or diarrhea, which turned out to be at least as widespread. Then came the hair. Barbers set up in a row like harvesters, shearing heads down to regulation. A lifetime of carefully parted hair, of pomade and combs, fell to the floor in similar soft piles, regardless of whether that head had come from a Tokyo alley, a Polish farm, or a Brooklyn tenement. Vanity was swept up with the dust. Women who saw them next sometimes cried or laughed, not always sure which they meant to do. Somewhere after the needles and the clippers, they were issued their new identities. A serial number, stamped into metal tags that clinked or thudded against their chests. In several armies, they were told to memorize the number as quickly as any prayer. From now on, the war would often know them as that string of digits. Paybooks were filled out, signatures practiced. This was another small, boring fact of war. Everyone signed their name far more often than they fired a weapon. Uniform issue looked glamorous in propaganda posters. In reality, it was closer to a frantic sale at a badly organized store. Piles of wool and cotton, belts, caps, helmets, underwear, socks. They were told to write their names on everything, inside caps, on shirt tags, on the canvas of bedrolls, on the butt of the rifle. Ink bled through the fabric, names smudged and faded. Ownership became at best a suggestion. Still, a surprising number of people later recognized a dead comrade by the scrawl on an inside collar. The fabric of the war was mostly uncomfortable. Wool that smelled of sheep when it rained,
cotton that stuck to the skin in tropical heat, heavy greatcoats that dragged tired shoulders down. The first lessons of military life were tactile: how to layer clothing so you were neither freezing nor sweating too heavily, how to tuck socks so they didn't crease under the heel, how to roll a blanket tight enough to pass inspection. Drill was supposed to turn this mass of ill-fitting cloth and uncertain limbs into soldiers. From the outside, drill looks dramatic, ranks wheeling in unison, boots stamping, but from the inside, it is repetition and dust. "Left, right, left," barked in a dozen languages over and over until the words ceased to sound like words. The ground of parade squares around the world was packed hard not only by boots, but by hours. "Again," said the sergeant. So they did it again. The body learned before the mind understood. Knees fell into the right rhythm. Arms swung correctly because the group pulled the individual into step. There were countless small humiliations: turning the wrong way, stepping off with the wrong foot, dropping a rifle. Officers spoke at them about discipline, esprit de corps, the honor of the regiment. Privately, many just tried to remember which pocket they had been told to put their notebook in. Barrack rooms were long rectangular lessons in compromise. 30, 50, sometimes 100 beds in 2 rows, a central aisle, windows that never opened or wouldn't close. The beds themselves, cots, bunks, simple frames with sagging springs, became tiny kingdoms. Your blanket, folded just so in some armies, rolled tight in others. Your small locker or kit bag, with your belongings carefully arranged. Photographs wedged into the mirror: a wife, a fiancé, a child, a dog, a football team, a village church, a favorite car. There were rules about beds. Corners had to be sharp enough that a coin could bounce, an American obsession. Blankets had to be folded to a regulation thickness, a British one. Mosquito nets had to be tucked in precisely, standard in the tropics. Everyone at some point had to make their bed twice, once properly, and then again because someone else had done theirs badly, and the sergeant believed in collective punishment. Inspections were a recurring performance. The night before, the barracks would be full of small, synchronized rituals. Boots lined up under bunks with toes out, polished until they reflected the single dangling bulb. Brass buckles and buttons rubbed with whatever came to hand, issued polish or substitute concoctions of spit, ash, and ingenuity until they gleamed. Rifles stripped, oiled, reassembled, the smell of gun oil and solvent drifting through the room. On inspection morning, everyone stood at the foot of their beds, hoping the officer's eye would skip over that one scuffed toe, that one slightly crooked blanket fold. Some officers loved inspections, lingering to point out specks of dust. Others rushed through, their minds on paperwork or leave. Either way, it was an unexciting but vital rhythm of service: polish, present, be judged, tidy up again. Food in the military was a vast, dull constant. Nutritionists, quartermasters, and planners worried endlessly about calories, vitamins, salt content. The men mostly worried about taste and quantity. There were national variations, but certain things were common. There were always potatoes in some form. There was usually bread, sometimes fresh, often stale. There was almost never enough fresh fruit. Coffee or tea kept people moving as effectively as orders did. American G as quickly learned the alphabet of rations. K for short-term field kits, C for canned, B for bread. They chewed on hard biscuits, smeared peanut butter, a chocolate that tasted of wax in the heat. The British queued for ladles of thin stew in enamel mugs, for tea strong enough to stand a spoon in, sweetened with condensed milk from dented tins. German soldiers drank ersatz coffee brewed from roasted chicory and grains and spread artificial honey on black bread. Soviet troops lived on kasha, cabbage soup, bread stretched with sawdust in the worst times, and the sudden, memorable luxury of a lump of sugar. Japanese conscripts carried balls of rice, pickled plums, dried fish. They boiled thin soups from whatever vegetables the countryside would yield. Mess halls were noisy, echoing places. Cutlery clattered on metal trays. Men called to friends and tried to sit in the same place, at the same table, as if a particular corner of the room could anchor them to normal life. There were complaints as reliable as the menu. The tea is too weak. The bread is too hard. The stew is all water and no meat. Professional cooks grumbled about supplies. Amateur cooks burned things. In the field, things got worse. Cooks wrestled giant pots over smoky fires. Sand blew into everything. Steam rose in the cold and carried the smell of grease across the lines. Meals arrived lukewarm in insulated containers, if they arrived at all. A hot meal after days of biscuits and cold meat could make grown men sigh. Another boring fact: everyone talked about food. Men remembered their mothers' cooking with unlikely precision. They promised each other that when they got home, they would eat entire pies by themselves, drink gallons of milk, demolish mountains of noodles, dumplings, sausages, rice. British soldiers dreamed of eggs. American ones imagined steaks. Japanese ones thought of white rice without barley mixed in. Hunger was a currency of conversation. Hygiene was a constant logistical problem solved with a mix of science and improvisation. The human body does not care for war. It sweats, excretes, sags, itches, and breaks out in rashes, regardless of ideology. So there were endless lectures about washing feet, brushing teeth, shaving. Men were shown lurid pictures of sexually transmitted diseases and instructed, sternly and repetitively, to be careful on leave. It was perhaps the most universally awkward educational program of the war. Bathing was irregular. In big camps, there were shower blocks, tiled, echoing rooms where hot water came in unreliable bursts. In smaller outposts, there were simply barrels, canvas bags with perforated bottoms, or a cold stream and a bar of army soap. Soviet soldiers broke holes in the ice and washed in water so freezing it made their skin burn. Tropical troops bathed in rivers under swarms of mosquitoes. Water discipline battles were fought silently in the privacy of bodies, between cleanliness and thirst. Lice were more persistent than most enemies. They flourished in seams, collars, underwear. In dugouts and trenches, men sat around boiling their shirts and trousers to kill the seam squirrels. They held cloth over flames until the lice popped like frying fat. Fleas added themselves to the mix wherever straw bedding was used. Everyone scratched. It was not part of any movie. The toilet arrangements of the war were both meticulously planned and profoundly unsatisfactory. Engineers dug latrine pits a set distance from living quarters. Units erected wooden seats over them or simply slung ropes as handholds. In some places, there were long rows of holes cut in planks, no dividers, modesty abandoned. Toilet paper, where it existed, was rationed. Many learned the uses of old newspapers, leaves, smooth stones. Civic discourse about the war rarely mentions the basic fact that millions of people spent an appreciable amount of time thinking about where and how to relieve themselves with some dignity. Paperwork followed them everywhere. Every army generated an ocean of forms: casualty returns, pay lists, equipment issue logs, leave applications, Disciplinary reports. Request chits for boots, for socks, for replacement dog tags. Clerks in uniform typed and carbon copied and filed. Their work is monotonous as that of any office, but now punctuated by air raid sirens or the distant rumble of artillery. Many soldiers discovered that the real backbone of the military machine was not the tank, but the filing cabinet. Travel to the front seldom felt like the start of an adventure. It was more often a succession of cramped spaces. Troop trains, long, overcrowded, steaming with breath and sweat, filled with the rattle of wheels and the smell of coal smoke. Men slept sitting up or sprawled on each other's knees. They shared sandwiches through windows with strangers on station platforms. On the walls, someone would scribble a date, a name, a crude joke. Across continents, these pencil marks accumulated, ghostly graffiti of movement. Ships were worse. Thousands of men crammed into the holds of transports, hammocks strung in layers, air thick with diesel and vomit. Convoy rules demanded silence and blackout at night. Seasickness turned the first days into misery. Men lay pale and sweating, unsteady on their legs. Above decks, if they were allowed there, they stared at endless gray water and listened nervously for the sound of alarms. Several would later describe that the most terrifying part of the war was not the enemy, but the thought of drowning in the dark, packed tight among strangers. Arriving at the front rarely lived up to the word. The front line was not a thin, bright edge, but a broad, blurred zone where seriousness gradually thickened. At first, it was just a camp further from home, with louder noises at night. Then, one day, they realized someone was firing in their direction, and their new normal had shifted. Daily life near the fighting still had a routine, but it was one built around waiting. Waiting for orders, for the cook to finish, for mail, for the rain to stop, for relief, for the next attack, for the war to finally be over. Time stretched and contracted strangely. An hour under bombardment could feel like a week. A week of quiet could vanish into a single memory of damp socks. Shelters varied. Some lived in trenches dug into muddy fields, roofed roughly with planks and corrugated iron. Others inhabited cellars of shattered houses or holes scraped into hillsides. Dugouts sprouted small domestic touches, shelves carved into earthen walls, hooks for coats, photographs pinned up, mugs hanging from nails. Men learned to sleep in their clothes, boots loosely unlaced, because orders might come at any time. Weather became an enemy in its own right. In Italy, mud swallowed vehicles up to their axles and turned marches into slow, sucking misery. In the Russian winter, breath froze in beards and rifles jammed with ice. Frostbite quietly claimed toes and fingers. In the Pacific, the heat sat on shoulders like a physical burden. Uniforms rotted, molds bloomed in boots, and tropical ulcers opened on shins and refused to close. Rain seeped into everything. Canvases dripped steadily, creating their own internal weather. Into this discomfort, small comforts were smuggled. Cigarettes were a nearly universal currency. A smoke could be traded for a favor, a turn on guard, a piece of extra bread. Pipes were tamped with ritual care, tobacco rationed out by strips. In some armies, alcohol appeared as an official morale booster. Rum for British sailors, sake for Japanese troops, vodka for Soviet soldiers, beer for Germans, bourbon or whatever could be found for Americans. A swig turned a night watch a little less lonely. Cards and dice filled idle hours. Decks became soft and grimy with use, their corners rounded, certain cards suddenly marked by wear that everyone politely ignored. Men played poker, rummy, local variations whose rules were continuously argued about. They gambled cigarettes, canned goods, buttons, money they did not yet have. Someone always developed a system and always lost in the end. Books and newspapers circulated, their pages worn thin by many hands. A novel sent from home might make the rounds of an entire company. People read anything: adventure stories, romances, classics they had once avoided in school, instruction manuals, even the ingredients lists on ration tins. Newspapers arrived sporadically, bringing outdated news that was still devoured. The official reports of the war rarely matched what they saw, but still they read, hungry for mention of their hometowns. Letters home were both lifeline and chore. Writing them meant concentrating, choosing words, deciding what to leave out. Men wiped mud off whatever paper they could find, balanced notebooks on knees, and tried to sound normal. They carefully did not describe the most frightening things. They complained about food, cold, boredom, officers, but usually stopped short of anything that would make mothers cry more than they already did. Censorship bent these letters into peculiar shapes. In many armies, officers or designated censors read through the mail, blacking out anything that mentioned locations, unit names, or casually critical remarks. Soldiers learned to write around these rules. "We are somewhere wet and muddy" could mean anywhere from Flanders to the South Pacific. Families at home learned to read between the lines. A sudden shift to short, cheerful letters often meant their writer had seen something too big to put on paper. The replies from home were folded into small packages of distant life. News of new babies, of harvests, of failed examinations, of marriages postponed or hurried through. Gossip about neighbors, lists of people who had joined up or been called. Recipes carefully copied out, as if belief in a future kitchen were a necessary spell. Some soldiers read these lines again and again until the paper broke at the folds. Not all soldiers were men. Women in auxiliary services and medical corps had their own catalogs of dull expertise. They typed, filed, operated switchboards, drove ambulances, repaired radios, packed parachutes, bandaged wounds, comforted the frightened. Long shifts on hospital wards, washing blood from floor tiles, changing dressings, coaxing spoonfuls of soup into mouths, writing last letters for men too weak to hold a pen. Their boredom and exhaustion were different in detail, but similar in feeling. Another uniformed routine, another life on hold. Discipline pressed down quietly. There were rules for everything: how to salute, how to address superiors, when to wear a cap, where to smoke, how to stack ammunition, at what angle to carry a bayonet during parade. Many broke some of these rules some of the time, and were punished in ways that did not make epic films. Extra guard duties, cleaning latrines, scrubbing floors, running laps, losing leave privileges. The military absorbed their resentment and kept going. Religion threaded through daily life in small ways. Chaplains and priests, rabbis and imams, set up portable altars on crates, draped white cloth over ammunition boxes, said mass in barns and on decks, led prayers in foxholes and beside hospital beds. Attendance varied. Some came faithfully. Others came to escape a chore or for the possibility of a biscuit afterward. Many prayed only privately, quietly, with no formal words, just a wish to go home alive. Superstitions filled the gaps where official doctrine could not reach. Men wore lucky charms, a coin, a medal, a ribbon, a piece of home soil in a small bag, a picture of a movie star folded into a pocket. They avoided certain seats in trucks, certain bunks in barracks, because bad things had happened to previous occupants. They knocked on wood, touched metal, refused to shave on certain days. Rational men, trained in engineering or law, formed private rituals because it made the uncontrollable feel slightly less so. Weapons maintenance was a daily task, independent of actual fighting. Rifles were stripped, cleaned, oiled, reassembled. Machine guns were checked and rechecked. The same was true for spades, vehicles, radios. Men whose lives had previously involved pens, plows, tools, brushes, became temporary mechanics, caretakers of complex systems. The war's machines spent more hours being looked after than used in anger. For every frontline infantryman, there were several others making sure his socks arrived. Logistics was not heroic, but it was immense. Drivers sat long hours behind steering wheels, coaxing overloaded trucks along broken roads, avoiding potholes big enough to tip them into ditches. Warehouse men counted crates of ammunition, sacks of flour, boxes of medical supplies. Office workers squared figures in ledgers. Railway workers shunted wagons in darkness under blackout curtains. Each shift ended with the knowledge that tomorrow would look much the same. The boredom could be a kind of pain. People used words like fed up, sick of it, climbing the walls. Time lost its contours. Some days they could not remember the date, only that it had rained or not, that the stew had been better or worse, that the night had been quiet or full of noise. Birthday celebrations were improvised with whatever came to hand. A cigarette passed around, a crude cake baked from rations, a collective handshake. Age often seemed less significant than the number of months spent out here. Prisoners of war discovered another version of monotonous existence. Barbed wire, roll calls, work details. The same fences, the same guards, the same weak soup. They learned languages from each other, traded skills, built tiny theaters and football pitches, made chess sets from carved bread or bone. Escape attempts were rare compared to the daily effort of simply enduring, of queuing for food, of waiting for the mail, of avoiding sickness. The war, for them, was gates that never opened. On leave, those lucky enough to get it experienced a temporary collision of worlds. One day you slept in a barrack full of snoring strangers, the next in your childhood bed, the sheets smelling faintly of line-dried sun. Between those two were train stations, ticket checks, delays, unexpected changes. The city or village you returned to was not the same. New faces in uniform, old neighbors gone, prices higher, lights dimmed or blacked out. People asked, "How is it at the front?" And most soldiers answered, "All right." It was easier than explaining that much of the time the front meant standing in line, doing what you were told, and being cold. Looking back after the war, many veterans remembered isolated days of terror or intense action in sharp detail. But the background against which those days stood out was made of extremely ordinary experiences. 1,000 mornings of waking up on thin mattresses, 1,000 evenings of cleaning boots, endless cups of tea or coffee drunk from chipped mugs. They remembered the names of comrades, the sound of certain sergeants' voices, the smell of wet wool, the feel of a letter in a pocket. These were the facts of their war,
small, repetitive, human. We admire and fear the war for its battles, its decisions, its moral vastness.
For those inside it, however, an ordinary day in uniform usually contained rather fewer heroics and rather more chores. They watered mules, they peeled potatoes, they waited in lines, they played cards, they lay awake and listened to someone snoring in the bunk above. They tried not to think too far ahead. In the final part, we will follow some of them back out of uniform again, or not, and look at what happened when all that routine, all those habits, met a world trying to remember how to be normal after having arranged itself for years around the dull, grinding demands of war. The war did not end all at once. It ended in pieces, in an office where a clerk stamped demobilized on a form, in a kitchen where someone turned off the radio and went back to shelling peas, at a railway platform where a woman realized slowly that the person stepping down from the carriage really was her husband, on a road where a column of prisoners stopped marching and did not quite dare to sit down. You can choose an official date, May 8th, August 15th, September 2nd, but that is the top-down version, the textbook finish. For the people who had lived inside the war's routines, the real ending was slower, messier, and strangely bureaucratic. It arrived as a new set of cues, a fresh list of instructions, a different kind of waiting. A British infantryman who had spent years moving forward when ordered, halting when ordered, now watched wall charts in the barracks to see when his number would come up in the demobilization lottery. Married men, older men, men with certain skills were to be released first. He studied the colored cards pinned to the board as if they were weather forecasts. He shaved, rolled his kit, went on route marches, though the killing was mostly over, because the army had nothing else to do with millions of men except keep them busy and tidy while the paperwork caught up. An American GI sat in a tent in the Philippines filling out forms about his points. Months overseas, battles fought, dependents at home, turning years of mud, fear, and boredom into a few numbers in pencil. The man in the next cot had more points. He would go home sooner. This was another boring fact of post-war life. Even the process of leaving the war was measured, weighed, ranked, and stamped. In the Soviet Union, millions of Red Army soldiers simply kept walking. Some demobilizations were a set of orders, others were a sudden absence of them. A man who had marched west to Berlin now turned east and trudged back along the same roads, past the same ruins, but in reverse. There were few trains, fewer lorries. He bartered his extra uniform buttons for bread. He slept in barns, in abandoned bunkers, under the open sky. When he finally reached his village, if it still existed, there was no desk waiting with a form to sign, no neat ceremony. There was just a lane, a door, someone standing in it. In Tokyo, in Berlin, in Warsaw, the war ended in cities that no longer looked like cities. People did not come home. They arrived at piles of bricks. Soldiers returned to discover that their house was now a hole. Civilians emerged from cellars and shelters into new, insecure routines of stepping around crater edges, of avoiding unexploded bombs and shells half buried in the mud. The first days without air raid sirens were disorienting. For years, a whole population had been trained to listen for a certain sound and to respond automatically. Light off, gas off, children up, boots on, door slammed. Then the sirens stopped. People woke up at night anyway, hearts racing, ears straining, hearing imaginary engines. Even when peace came, sleep took longer to participate. Another boring end-of-war fact: millions did not leave uniform at all, at least not right away. Armies did not evaporate just because their governments signed documents. They shrank, relabeled themselves, changed missions. The same men who had bombed, shelled, and advanced were now told to guard depots, run railways, administer captured territories, supervise elections, maintain order. Peace had to be occupied. In Germany and Japan, defeated soldiers became prisoners, though many of them wore the same jackets, the same boots, and slept in the same barracks. They were counted, sorted, interrogated. They cleaned latrines, filled in potholes, unloaded ships. The work was different, but it was also the same. Assignments, schedules, petty authority. The humiliations were sometimes grand, but mostly they were small. The guard's bored stare, the bad coffee, the wait for mail that did not come. For millions of people who had been civilians throughout, the end of the war meant a change not from uniform to suit, but from one set of shortages to another. In Britain, rationing did not relax. In some ways, for a while, it got tighter. An ordinary housewife who had grown used to stretching powdered egg and dried milk now found that bread,
which had remained unrationed throughout the worst of the bombing, was to be rationed in peace. She counted slices, cut them thinner, swept the crumbs carefully from the cutting board. Her war against waste did not end with the peace. The habit of scraping the jam jar with the back of the spoon would stay with her for decades. In France, people who had spent years whispering, queuing, and glancing over their shoulders for German soldiers now queued for coal, for new identity cards, for news of the missing. The black market, which had flourished under occupation, did not disappear. It adjusted. Cigarettes and nylon stockings became as important a currency as francs. This, too, would leave traces in ordinary lives. An uncle who knew someone, a drawer with suspiciously plentiful supplies of coffee, a reluctance to ask too many questions.
There were weddings, a kind of administrative and emotional demobilization. Couples who had written each other 3 letters a week for years now had to learn how to have a conversation that did not need stamp or censor. A young woman who had known her fiancé mainly in ink and sepia photographs now had to get used to the sound of him snoring, to the way he arranged his socks. They were suddenly sharing real kitchens, not just fantasies. The dull, fidgety patience of war turned into the dull, fidgety compromises of marriage. War brides crossed oceans on overcrowded ships, not as glamorous heroines of newsreels, but as seasick young women sleeping in narrow bunks beneath decks that smelled of disinfectant and boiled cabbage. They stood in line for vaccinations and foreign paperwork, then started their new lives in rented rooms in Detroit,
Sydney, or Manchester, learning to cook with unfamiliar ingredients, struggling with slang, writing long letters home that mostly described the weather. Bereavement, too, was administered in forms and routines. The notification telegrams had been coming for years. Their arrival did not stop neatly when the guns did. Some families received the official word months after their loved one had died, because the body had only just been found or identified or confirmed as not coming back. A mother would take a folded piece of paper from a stranger's hand, read a stranger's typewritten words, regret to inform you, and then put the paper in a drawer. Later there would be more letters about pensions, about personal effects, about memorials. Grief, in its everyday form, required appointments at offices, signatures, stamps, There were also the missing, a category that turned absence into a kind of permanent half-presence. A wife who had not heard from her husband in years, but who had never received the fatal telegram, lived in a strange routine of hope and exhaustion. She listened to any rumor, any story of someone seen in a camp, on a road, in a hospital. She wrote to the Red Cross, filled out forms with height, eye color, scars, distinctive marks. War's most dramatic fact, the mass disappearance of millions, became, at the level of ordinary life, an endless, repetitive act of describing a face. Displaced persons camps were another world of small, persistent details. People who had survived camps, forced labor, marches, and bombings now spent months or years in barbed wire enclosures that were supposed to be temporary,
but lasted long enough to become routines. Each camp had its own queues, its own black markets, its own unofficial postal routes. Children went to improvised schools where they learned new languages and did sums on slates borrowed from abandoned German classrooms. Adults attended committee meetings, argued about colonization schemes, read and reread lists of names pinned up on boards. People married, had children, made friends, held grudges, in places that did not appear on many maps. Going home, when it was possible, turned out to be another kind of work. A Polish farmer who had been taken as a laborer to the Reich now returned to find his village under a different flag. New authorities, new slogans, new forms. He registered for land, for ration cards, for tools. He helped rebuild a barn, not only with wood and nails, but with borrowed nails, borrowed hammers, borrowed time. The war had ended, but the habit of borrowing and owing favors, food, information remained. In cities, people lived in the rubble. Germans coined a word, Trümmerfrauen, rubble women, for those, mostly women, who spent long days clearing bricks, stacking them, cleaning mortar off them for reuse. They swung hammers, pushed carts, broke down walls, not in a burst of patriotic enthusiasm, but because if they did not clear the rubble, there would be nowhere to put a bed. They wore whatever shoes they had. Many wrapped their feet in rags. They carried their lunches in old gas mask containers. The noise of peacetime for them was not silence, but the clink, clatter, and crash of falling bricks. In the United States, demobilized servicemen stepped off ships into a country of neon lights and full shop windows. Yet their new lives were also composed of lines and forms. Lines at the Veterans Administration, forms for the GI Bill, applications for mortgages and college admissions and small business loans. A mechanic who had spent the war fixing tank engines now sat in a classroom trying to follow lectures on history or engineering, surrounded by younger students who had been boys when he went away. His notebooks were neat or messy in the same old ways, but his mind kept drifting to things he would not talk about. He had brought habits home with him. He ate quickly. He did not leave food on the plate. He checked the doors twice before bed. The noise of a car backfiring made him tense slightly, just enough that his wife noticed. He woke early because, in the army, you woke early. He folded his clothes at night in a little pile, ready to be put on quickly, just in case. These little routines were the quiet spoor of the war in his daily life, boring to describe and hard to change. Women who had taken men's jobs in factories, offices, and farms were told, politely or not, to step aside. The evacuation of women from the workplace was not sudden or total, but it was real. A riveter who had worked on aircraft wings left the factory with a modest ceremony and a handshake, sometimes a certificate of thanks,
and went back to a smaller world of laundry and grocery lists. Yet she did not quite fit into that smaller world anymore. She had known the feel of a wage envelope, the rhythm of a whistle that marked shifts, the dirty satisfaction of grease on her hands after a day's work. Those memories hovered in the background when she changed nappies, scrubbed floors, or sewed name tags into school uniforms. In Britain and elsewhere, there were housing lists. Councils drew up priorities: veterans with families, war widows, bombed-out families, people with medical needs. Inspectors visited damp, cramped rooms and measured them with tape. They declared them overcrowded or acceptable. People learned to present themselves as deserving, to emphasize the cough, the child, the leaking roof. Prefabricated houses, prefabs, sprang up in fields, neat and temporary-looking, with thin walls and new smells. Families moved in, hung curtains, planted small gardens. Many would still be there decades later, long after temporary had hardened into normal. Children born during or just after the war grew up in a kind of hybrid world. They played on bomb sites, turning craters into forts and the skeletons of houses into castles. In their games, unexploded shells, rusting helmets, old ration tins were props that adults treated with wary respect. School lessons took place in rooms that still had tape marks on the windows. Air raid shelters at the edge of the playground became hideouts, adventure spots. Adults told them not to go in. They went in anyway. These children learned about the war not as a distant event, but as something visible in the shape of streets and the gaps where houses should have been. Yet their everyday concerns were the same as children's tend to be anywhere: homework, sweets, friendships. They lined up with ration books in hand, memorized point values for chocolate and bacon, and argued about whose father had done what in the war without quite understanding what any of it meant. Across Europe and Asia, people adjusted to new flags, new borders, new slogans. A Czech shopkeeper repainted the sign above his door several times within a few years to reflect changes in language, policy, and ideology. The bread he sold remained much the same, dense or light depending on the flour, cut into the same everyday slices. At closing time, he swept the floor, counted the day's takings, worried about supplies, as shopkeepers always have. The massive redirection of history passed through his hands as minor changes in packaging, new types of licenses, unexpected inspections.
Another dull but important fact of post-war life: war left leftovers, and these leftovers filtered into daily routines. Surplus uniforms were cut down into work clothes, coats, children's jackets. Tents became awnings or garden sheds. Ammunition boxes turned into stools, cupboards, toy chests. In many homes, cutlery, crockery, blankets, and even furniture were stamped with government marks, faded but still there. People ate soup from bowls that had once been stacked in army warehouses. Language kept some of the war's leftovers too. Phrases like "on the home front," "dig for victory," "make do and mend" lingered in conversation and advertising. People referenced the Blitz spirit long after the Blitz. A Japanese commuter muttered "air raid drill days" when pushed into a packed train, remembering the tightness of shelters. A Russian babushka compared today's minor shortage unfavorably with 42, 43, when we really had nothing. Memory became a measuring stick for new inconveniences. In societies that had persecuted their own citizens, there was another layer of adjustment, living next door to people whose actions during the war were now whispered about. An ordinary Dutch housewife stood in the same bakery queue as the widow of a man who had been in the wrong uniform. In a Polish town,
A man who had nodded to the occupying police now nodded to newly returned neighbors whose lives his nods had once endangered. In many cases, there were no dramatic confrontations. There were awkward silences at weddings, empty chairs at Christmas tables, a tendency to cross the street rather than talk. For some, peace brought not relief, but a new wave of fear.
In Eastern Europe, men who had fought with the wrong resistance unit, or in the wrong army, were now suspect. They hid medals, burned photographs, quietly rewrote their personal histories. Their everyday lives became a series of dodges, avoiding certain topics at work, declining invitations, carefully choosing which stories to tell their children. Surveillance was another routine, made up of tiny, repeated acts. The note in a file, the phone call logged, the neighbor's comment. Not everyone came back from war with visible injuries. A clerk in a small-town office might now be a man who woke sweating from dreams he did not discuss. He filled in forms for other people, stamped them, filed them, joked about politics in the approved way, and went home each evening to a kitchen where the light fell just so on a table. Some days, he managed not to think about a particular field or road or train siding. Other days he could not stop. His wife learned to recognize the signs and to steer conversation away from certain words. This was the unheroic front line of post-war life. One person quietly trying to help another person stay just functional enough. In Japan, the occupation brought new foods into ordinary diets. People who had spent the last months of the war eating millet, acorns, and whatever they could find now encountered canned meat, wheat bread, powdered milk. Children drank unfamiliar milk in school, their bodies slowly filling out in ways their parents could see and measure. At the same time, teachers rewrote lessons overnight. Yesterday's heroes disappeared from textbooks, maps changed. Students copied new characters onto the same old paper. There was humor, of a dry and often bitter kind. Veterans told stories that carefully left out the worst parts and highlighted the absurd. The time someone saluted the wrong person, the cooking disasters in field kitchens, the sergeant who could never remember anyone's name. Civilians traded jokes about rationing, about bureaucracy, about the new bosses who looked suspiciously like the old bosses. Laughter did not erase anything, but it filled the long, ordinary evenings during which forgetting proved to be impossible. Religious life, too, had to find its place in this new normal. Churches, temples, mosques that had served as shelters or had been destroyed were repaired, reopened, or rebuilt. Services were held in hallways, cellars, schoolrooms. People prayed, sometimes with renewed fervor, sometimes with a kind of polite distance. They thanked God for survival, or wrestled silently with why so many had not been spared. The religious calendar, Sundays, feast days, fasts, offered rhythms that were older than blackouts and curfews, and some people clung to these rhythms as a way to mark time that was not defined by war. In the Soviet Union, young men who had gone to war as peasants came back as potential city dwellers. The state offered education, jobs in factories, apartments in new blocks. The move from village to city, from field to assembly line, from log hut to concrete stairwell was another massive historical shift that played out in small details. Learning to use a flush toilet, to queue for a bus, to navigate a bureaucracy that cared more about paperwork than about whether it was harvest time. For people in colonies and occupied territories, the war's end often did not mean the end of fighting, but its transformation into something called independence movements or emergencies.
A British soldier who had just left Europe might now find himself in Malaya or Palestine, patrolling roads, searching cars, drinking tea in barracks while politicians argued about mandates and decolonization. The daily routine, guard duty, inspections, boredom, continued under different skies, against different backdrops, with different enemies or hostile elements. For local populations, the uniforms changed, but the presence of armed strangers did not. In homes on every continent, souvenirs of the war settled into drawers, boxes, and trunks. A German helmet became a thing to try on in the attic. A packet of letters tied with string sat in a cupboard.
A medal was wrapped in tissue and occasionally taken out, its ribbons smoothed by fingers that then turned back to peeling potatoes. These objects, so charged in the moment, became part of the background. They moved house with their owners, were forgotten, rediscovered, and eventually shown to grandchildren, who listened politely and then returned to their own lives. It is one of the strangest, boring facts about the Second World War. A conflict that rearranged continents, destroyed empires, industrialized death, and introduced new extremes of cruelty and courage was also, for billions of the people who lived through it, a long sequence of ordinary days. Those days did not stop when the peace treaties were signed. They simply changed their content. There were still kitchens to clean, shirts to wash, crops to plant, taxes to pay. There were illnesses, birthdays, jokes, petty arguments. There were apprenticeships, school exams, first kisses. People fell in love not with veterans or survivors, but with someone whose hair curled in a particular way when it rained, who laughed at a certain kind of joke, who preferred their tea a bit too strong. They bore children, who grew up hearing about the war as the explanation for why their grandparents never wasted bread, why their parents went silent when certain topics came up, why their neighborhood had an odd gap where 3 houses should stand. The war continued in those silences, in those gaps, in the way older hands reached automatically for the light switch at the faintest rumble. It lived on in skills, in a woman's ability to make soup from almost nothing, in a man's insistence on keeping tools well oiled and in their proper place, just in case. It lingered in the way people counted, unconsciously, how many stairs, how many windows, how many exits, because it had once mattered very much to know. As time passed, the routines of peace thickened around these habits. New boring facts replaced old boring facts. Instead of Luftwaffe raids, people grumbled about television licenses. Instead of blackouts, they worried about traffic jams. Instead of gas masks, they had insurance forms. Yet in elderly people's minds, the wartime world remained extraordinarily vivid. They could still name the neighbors in 1941, could still taste the ersatz coffee, could still hear the cadence of marching boots on a frosty morning. The history we usually tell about the Second World War deals in campaigns, In leaders, in treaties, and turning points. That history is real and important. But beneath and around it, there were the daily histories, of meals cooked and eaten, of shirts worn and worn out, of queues endured, of jokes told, of letters written, of beds shared or slept in alone. These, too, are facts of the war, and they are often boring when you isolate them. A certain number of grams of cheese per week, a particular color of ration book, the design of a demobilization suit, the schedule of a train that carried workers to a munitions plant. But taken together, they make up the texture of what it was like to be alive then. They are what the war felt like from inside a body, in a particular street,
on a particular Tuesday. The men and women who lived that texture have mostly gone now. Their habits, however,
have left faint imprints on the way we live. In inherited thriftiness, in family stories, in recipes that make strange substitutions, in the way someone of a certain age still reaches for a torch when the electricity flickers. The war's giants, its battles, its leaders, its horrors, cast long shadows. Within those shadows, the ordinary people who watered mules, peeled potatoes, filled out forms, and queued for bread made their lives as best they could, one mundane action at a time. To remember them accurately is not only to recall where and how they fought, suffered, or died, but also to remember what they did most of the time, the small, repetitive human things that kept themselves and others going through the war, and then, more quietly, through the peace that followed.